Hello and welcome to Restoration DIY, and whether you're new or returning, it's great to have you here and I hope you enjoy the video. In this episode I'll be making a vase from Sapele segmented rings cast in black and purple epoxy resin. So without further ado, let's get into it. The lengths of Sapele had already passed over the jointer. I didn't show it because it's big and difficult to film. Next I used a thicknesser to plane down the remaining two sides, reducing each piece down to the required size. This is only the second outing for this machine and I love it. The timber comes out silky smooth and with zero snipe. I wish I'd bought one a long time ago. The next job was to cut the segments. In total I needed to make 7 rings, each with 18 segments. 3 rings would be around 190mm diameter, 2 more at around 200mm diameter, then one at 225mm, and the last one for the rim at around 250mm. This is the last lot for the rim and are wider than the rest to allow for the overhang. With all the segments cut, they had to be sanded to clean up the edges, then I could start assembling the rings. For this project I wanted to use coloured resin joints. To do this I used a 3D printed template to build each ring. With the segments in place, I used an elastic band to hold them. Then I superglued a previously assembled ring on top. When the glue had cured, I flipped the whole thing over, removed the template and glued on another 3D printed spacer. These 2 rings are for the base. Next I assembled the first midsection ring and superglued the base on top. Or at least that was the intention. After applying some pressure, I went to flip it over to find that only 3 of the segments had stuck. The rest just pulled away. Basically, the spacer wasn't wide enough, so I had to reassemble the ring. So with the ring reassembled, I glued the base on top and it stuck. The next midsection ring went on with no problems. I added a solid piece of Sapele to the core in the base and filled the remaining void with waste softwood, roughly cut to shape and superglued in place. With the base and the midsection assembled, it was time to do the first resin casting. For this blanket was placed into a pre-waxed bucket, then I mixed 3 batches. Black mica powder was the chosen colour. After this was added, I thoroughly mixed each one for about 2 minutes. With there being just one colour, I poured them into the casting straight away. This was put into the pressure pot and left to cure. I knew there wasn't enough to completely fill it. For now this would do, then I would top it up later in the day. Moving on, the last 2 rings for the rim were next. These were put together in the same way and placed in a bigger bucket. As before, the voids were filled with waste softwood held in place with superglue. Then I mixed 4 batches of resin. Most would be for this casting, the rest I used to top up the base midsection casting. Originally I was just going to use black, but decided to use purple as well, just to add a bit of interest. After topping up the base mid-casting, I filled the rim casting, then they were both put in the pressure pot and 50 psi was added. This was then left overnight to cure. And just for note, because there were now two colours, the resin had been left to pre-cure, but not for as long as usual. It's the next day and the resin has cured nicely, with no visible cracks or voids, and the colour separation looks good as well. I marked the centre and drilled holes in both blanks, then I fixed the base midsection blank to the lathe and set to getting it to round. The segmented blank was a good fit in the casting bucket, so there wasn't a lot of resin to remove. The Easy Wood Tools full-size finisher was soon through to the segmented rings in the upper section. Then I turned my attention to the base, exposing the segments and getting the blank nicely balanced. The point of doing this is mainly to level the top, ready for gluing on the rim. But I have to do the balancing first, next I'll cut the mortise, and then I can turn it around and work on the top face. With the balancing done, I cut the mortise. To do this, first I remove the resin from the underside to expose the segments. Next I cut and define the outer edge of the mortise with a 1/4 inch parting tool. Then I cut the dovetail with a dovetail cutter, and to finish I remove the inner material with a bowl gouge. Mortise finished, I sanded just the underside from 80 to 3000 grit, and then I applied a finish, topped off with Hampshire Sheen gloss finishing wax. With the blank turned round, I could level the top. For this, I removed the waste resin to expose the segments with a full-size carbide cutter. Then I used a skew chisel to flatten and level the surface, and after a quick check, it was done. Base done, I fixed the upper rim section to the lathe. This was also going to be balanced, but the main task here was to level the underside. To get it balanced, I used the carbide cutters to remove the waste resin, exposing the top ring segments and the waste softwood packers. For now, I could have left them in place, but I decided to get rid of them. This would make it easier to align the two blanks when gluing them together. After a final pass with a bowl gouge, I moved on to the underside. For this I'd be trying something new. I wanted to leave a layer of resin in place. This would then create a resin joint when the two blanks were glued together. But I'd made a mistake. I'd used mixing sticks to hold the segments in place for the casting when I should have used a 3D printed spacer. The ends of the mixing sticks would most likely show through in the finished piece, but there wasn't anything I could do about it now. So with the underside level, I moved on to the glue up. For this I used rapid setting epoxy resin coloured with purple mica powder. When mixed, I spread it evenly on top of the base, then I placed it on the rim, being careful to align the joints and get it centred. I left it for around 30 minutes for the epoxy to fully harden, then I fixed it back on the lathe and set to getting it balanced. Then I could begin the shaping. After removing material from the rim, the blank was balanced, so then I set to cutting away the remaining resin covering the lower segments. This was done with a full-size carbide finisher. Once the resin was removed, I got my first look at the segment alignment, and it looked okay. The only downer was the mixing sticks, but I had a plan to get rid of those later on. This project was always going to have a pedestal. Unlike my last few projects, I already knew how I wanted this piece to look. I used a 3/8 bowl gouge to form the cutout, switching between the upper and lower cut line, going deeper with each pass. At this stage I wasn't sure if I was going to cut through to the black resin in the core of the base, so I stopped short and switched to shaping the upper part, blending the cutout into the midsection, then up to the edge of the rim. In this clip you can see the ends of the mixing sticks, but thankfully there were no voids to deal with, so I went back to shaping the surface, shear scraping the resin and segments. I was toying with the idea of having a fatter midsection curving into a thinner part under the rim, but I wasn't sure if this would work. To give myself time to think about it, I concentrated on the base, refining the shape. This is where I decided to cut through to the black resin, but that would have to wait to the end, as I wanted to retain the strength until the inside was hollowed out. Having got the base closer to the final shape, I could see that the curvy upper wasn't going to work, so I spent a fair bit of time refining the shape. And whilst doing this, I was thinking about what to call this piece. Is it a bowl or is it a vase? Even now, editing this, I still can't make my mind up. Let me know in the comments what you think it is. Now the outside was more or less to shape, it was time to deal with the mixing sticks. I considered cutting them back with a small chisel and filling the hole with resin, but in the end I decided to cut the whole joint back with a thin parting tool to a depth of around 2mm. Then I mixed some rapid set epoxy resin with purple mica powder to fill the recess. Filling the joint was straightforward. I did it in two sections, allowing the first to slightly harden before doing the second. Then I let it stand for around 30 minutes. Then I used a large negative rate scraper to gently cut the repair back level with the segments. There were still a few low spots, so to break up the solid purple band, I used black star bond to fill the voids. I used the star bond with an accelerator to fill each void. I had to do this a couple of times, But once done, I sanded with 80 grit to remove the high spots, then I blended it in with a negative rate scraper. A few more passes with a skew chisel, and the outside was more or less done. So on to the hollowing out. This is the deepest piece I've ever had to do, so I began by making sure the chuck and the tailstock were nice and tight. Then I set to with a bowl gouge, cutting through the top layer of resin into the segments and softwood waste block. Using the gouge gave me a lot of control, and with this piece being mainly wood with some resin infill, I was able to make good progress. I felt the best way to do it would be to cut down so far, then remove the top off the centre support, then relocate the tailstock. This way I could go down in stages, keeping the tailstock in position for added security. Inevitably, the tailstock did get in the way, preventing me getting a good cutting angle with the gouge, so I had to switch to the carbide cutter. This was okay, but it just wasn't cutting, so out came the side cutting scraper. This ripped into the waste material, but even after changing to a curved tailstock, it was still chattering and vibrating, threatening a big catch. So after a bit, I put it to one side and continued with the gouge when I could, switching to the carbide for the more inaccessible bits. Okay, so what follows is very repetitive. Basically, I cut down through each ring using a combination of the bowl gouge and the carbide cutter until I reach the base. So what I'll do is I'll skip forward to where I'm removing the last bit of the centre support. After removing the tailstock and repositioning the tool post, I carefully offered up the bowl gouge, but as soon as it touched the softwood, it grabbed and very nearly ripped the workpiece off the lathe. With the workpiece repositioned and the chuck retightened, I very carefully removed what was left of the softwood and resin using the full-size carbide cutter. Relieved that was done, I refined the rim with a skew. To finish the inside, I used a small negative rate scraper to blend and fair the surface. I sanded with 80 grit to check for any low spots or ridges, then it was on to the last bit, exposing the resin in the base. Using the 1/4-inch parting tool, I was soon through what was left of the segments into the black resin, and I was relieved to see it was solid, so no crack repairs would be needed. Next, I worked on the base. This looked too big, so I set to shear scraping the top surface. Then I reduced the diameter. I got a bit carried away, but I think I stopped just in time. The skew chisel squared up the edge of the base, then I thinned it down a bit more with a bowl gouge. That done, I used the carbide cutter to shape the resin core, blending it into the upper and lower rings. Then a final go with a skew to refine the surface, and it was done. Then I sanded, inside and out, from 80 to 3000 grit. Sanding done, I cleaned down with denatured alcohol. Then I applied 2 liberal coats of sanding sealer, each one denibbed with a non-abrasive Scotch pad. Next up, Yorkshire Grit. Just a single coat, thoroughly cleaned away until no more residue is picking up on the paper towel. Then the resin polishing. First up, Mirka Polar Shine 10. A single application, thoroughly cleaned away, ready for the next stage. Polar Shine 5. Another single coat, thoroughly polished off to leave a deep shine. And to finish, Hampshire Sheen Gloss Finishing Wax. 2 coats, applied with more paper towel, buffed to seal and protect the surface. And that's it, another project finished. This was something I've wanted to try for a long time, and whilst I had some problems along the way, I think it turned out okay, and I hope you like it too. The Sapele segments are a bit irregular, but that perhaps just adds to the character. Once I've refined the technique a bit more, I'll be doing another similar project, perhaps with ash and 3-colour resin. With that said, I'd like to thank you all for watching. Please subscribe, a thumbs up will be great, and comments are always welcome. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye for now.